You're listening to the Bear in Mind Podcast, episode 124.
A podcast that breaks it down so you can break the cycle for good. Now, your host, Tara Rama, but you can call her T.
I didn't think that I had an anger problem. And especially before I became a parent, I actually looked really calm on the outside. And at a certain point, I probably, the anger would build up and I would have an argument, a heated argument with my partner. And then it would go back to a really long time of being really calm. And I would say I didn't have an anger problem. I wasn't violent. None of those things that we associate and society associates with us as an anger problem. And then when I became a parent, I noticed I was yelling more frequently. I was like, where did this come from? Just like my mother, that comes up a lot. So I want to talk about hidden anger because when I'm talking about breaking the cycle, I'm talking about breaking what I think is the most common cycle. It's the anger and guilt cycle. And some people can't recognize that it's essentially going to be about managing both emotions. And a lot of times we say, well, you can look at it and go, well, I don't really have an anger problem. I don't really yell. I don't do any of those things that you're talking about. And that was true for me. And I'm going to talk to you about why the two really go hand in hand and why one may be masking the other. And when one is masking the other, and I'm going to talk about that specific example, the cycle is really kind of out of control because in essence, both emotions, anger and guilt, are emotions you're going to have throughout your whole life. You're not going to eliminate them. All you're going to do is just understand that. And from there, do what you want intentionally with that information that emotion is providing for you, and take the course of action that you want to take in your life. That's all. That's when you know that you have broken the cycle. And so when the cycle can go to one side, it is often like something is hidden, and it's usually anger. Anger is hidden, and it can show up. And this is probably one of the biggest signs that I see in myself. And I also see with people that I work with my clients. And when I talk to friends, I can see that sometimes we can spend a lot of time in guilt. We spend a huge amount of time in guilt. And sometimes we spend a lot of time in shame that I'm not worthy and putting ourselves down. And we spend a lot of time there. And that's where I was at. I was spending, in fact, a lot of time in more of a, not even in an anger guilt cycle, but more in just shame. And then every once in a while, the anger would get heightened, and it would almost be I was overreacting. It would be that the anger was so disproportionate to what I was arguing with my partner about. So that is actually one of the big signs that there is actually hidden anger going on, is when we are spending a lot of time in guilt or shame. And what we're doing when we're hiding anger is we're essentially avoiding anger, yet we still have that emotion in us. And it sounds weird to say it still has an emotion in us. It means it stays there, and maybe it moves on because, anger is a very reactive emotion. It could pass on. Sometimes it builds on top of each other because we haven't processed past anger. And that often, the other sign is it looks like it turns into being resentful. So you're keeping score, you're holding grudges. And a lot of other times it looks like having a negative viewpoint on a lot of things. And we don't usually recognize this in ourselves. I know I didn't recognize this in myself as if I was this negative person. And then as I started to become more aware of my emotions, I started to see how negative I was over everything. Like all of a sudden I'd be so negative about my friend showing up late. And other times I wouldn't be, but if I was hiding anger, avoiding anger, everything kind of had a negative perspective to it. And then I would go to this kind of extrapolate, nobody's on time or nobody values time anymore, things like that. I would go even extrapolate into so many other things. And one of the other signs that I saw in me that I was actually hiding away from anger and avoiding it was that I was procrastinating and delaying things in my life. I wasn't going after maybe solutions and taking actions that I wanted to take. And I will use a very specific example about hiding anger. And this was something that I did very well with my partner. And we kind of have this relationship where we both actually kind of have the same viewpoint of anger. It's hiding anger because we believed anger is bad. If we look at the cycle, and if we're looking at generational and we're looking at what we learn also from the people that we grow up with, is that anger was really a bad emotion, and that expressing it in myself was something I shouldn't be doing it. I shouldn't even have boundaries or anything like that that would be standing up for the self. Because when we have anger, then we want to stand up for ourselves and we want to take action. And even those kind of actions, those were definitely not tolerated growing up. So I slowly took on the belief that anger is a really bad emotion to have when it's not bad or good, or it's not legit in some situations and legit in other situations. It is just an emotion, just like every other emotion. It's a human emotion, and you're going to experience it. One of the things that I had hidden anger over was how my partner and I handled our schedules, and how I would often feel that he wasn't respecting my time. He would go ahead and schedule things without asking me or not telling me until the last minute that something was scheduled and we were going to something. And so there were all these things centered around the schedule, the agenda, coordination of coordination of our time. And I noticed that even today I still haven't, even though I've worked on quite a bit of it, it's still something where I look at it and I still have kind of like this irritated approach to it. And I can now understand it and be intentional with it and not come from this place of anger. What was happening in the past is that I would feel bad about being angry at him for this thing, about not considering my schedule, because I would say things like, to put me back into guilt, put me back into shame, I'm being so petty. Boom, I was in shame. I'm being petty. I'm this person that's nagging their partner over a little thing in the schedule, all of those things. I would have those habitual sentences in my head, and I would bypass anger and I would go straight into shame. And the anger is still there, even though shame might be the predominant emotion I was feeling, is kind of suppressing the anger. And then eventually it was almost like I would start keeping score of how many times this happened. And then I would start saying, well, this always happens. You don't take my schedule into account. So there was that. There was the resentfulness. And then I started looking at everything he did in a negative way because I was not looking at why I was angry. I was avoiding it, going straight into shame. And then whenever the shame would ease up a little bit, anger would manifest itself in some form of resentment. And then the other piece of that is that I was avoiding actually the solution to this. Is if anger was telling me something, I want my time to be considered, or I want to be included, and I want these things to happen. I wasn't even looking at the solution of how to get there, of how to coordinate our schedules, of how to not have things double booked. So I was even avoiding a solution and delaying that part because I know that part of that solution was discussing the schedule with him. So I would avoid that altogether. And so on the outside, I really looked like, for an extended period of time, for a few months before all of a sudden I felt like I would explode and it was so out of control. I looked really calm. I looked like a person that, okay, yeah, that's okay. We'll do that with the schedule. Almost like it was like things didn't bother me when really inside they were bothering me. Now, here's the funny thing about anger, especially if you are feeling like me, like you don't have an anger problem and that you think and you believe that anger is bad or like it's the root of all evil or something. And I believe that. Here's, I think, what is so ironic about anger is that understanding it and looking at it and not avoiding it and opening up to the idea of feeling anger, or just even a little bit of the willingness, you don't need to go all head in, is what that does, that understanding of why it's there actually helps you control it, have authority over the anger, believe it or not, because anger can feel kind of out of control, but when you understand it, and then probably the most beautiful thing that came out of me working at my anger, and I still try to understand it. There's so many layers, and I still understand, and I'm trying to understand the anger when it initially comes up, and looking at it with a bit of curiosity and willingness, is that is the key that I think helps you have amazing relationships. When you can look at something and notice, like if a friend shows up and you can notice, oh, it irritates me when people show up late to a coffee date or anything you have planned with a friend. If you can notice that and be okay with it and accept that you're irritated by it, that you're angry that it happens, and know that that's coming because you want people to be on time. It's coming from a very specific, people should be on time, and accept that about yourself. It lets you have acceptance for yourself, which is already improving your relationship. And from a place of accepting yourself, you have acceptance for others. And that is where I think really anger opens yourself up to having amazing relationships with everyone in your life. That's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.